All right, guys, we are getting into it here. Chapter 10, we're going to do performance management and appraisal. And the big idea of this chapter is to figure out what is the process by which we evaluate someone's performance, wins and losses, right? Some of them, if you've ever had a performance evaluation that was good and it was helpful, then you know that. And if not, which is most of them, they're not particularly strong. So we're going to try to walk through that. And kind of the one things I want you to make sure that you get is that there isn't one way that works for every job, right? There are some main principles that we try to do universally, but not one method because jobs are different and performance feedback is kind of different. So we'll walk through it. There was a book written quite a while ago by a guy named Robert Kelly. It was called How to Be a Star at Work. And so he basically lays out this argument that politics is something that people usually look at in a bad light, like schmoozing, brown nosing, stuff like that. But politics, specifically relationships, are how things get done in an organization, in what we call the informal organization. So if you see someone politicking and they get their way, someone might go, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to put my head down and I'm going to do my job and I'm going to go to work. Well, that's fine. You can do that. You're just losing at that particular strategy called politicking. So I'm not saying it's what we should strive toward, but if we're doing well in our job, we should bear in mind that that is, in many ways, how things end up getting done. So when we're in class, in a face-to-face class, I'll tell students sometimes, go ahead and evaluate my performance. And I don't really care what it is, but just come up with a reason why. And inevitably, they'll come up with a couple things, usually because there's social bias involved, a couple things that they like, and they'll say, oh, it's good or something like that. I'll go, okay, why? And they'll say, well, you keep me awake in class, or it makes me get up early so I come to class or something like that. And I try to highlight the point that when you're giving someone performance feedback, if you give them what's called trait-based feedback, that is something about themselves versus something that they do, then it's not really helpful. If you go to an employee and say, hey, you're marked down on your performance because you have a bad attitude. Okay, thanks a lot, buddy. Like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? Or you marked down late on your performance because you're not really engaged. Classic word. What does that even mean? But if you say you're marked down because you come in late to work on average 3 days a week, between 5 and 15 minutes late, and just sends a message you don't want to be here, then at least you've got to something behavioral, that is, that the person's actually doing, which they can then adjust their behavior. Same thing, I mean, we talk about it in a work relationship, but same thing in any relationship. If I come home, my wife and I are in a disagreement, and she says, or I say something like, oh, well, you always do that. Well, that's not really helpful. Or you have a bad attitude about, whatever we do for the holidays. That's not helpful either. The more you can get behavioral, and especially if you can get results with behavior, then people can actually adjust their performance. So if you come home and your roommate's left a mess all over and you say, like, I'm moving out because you're a slob, that's not really behavioral. But if you say, this stuff that's all over the ground, the dirty dishes, whatever it is, then it's okay, they can actually make a connection between those things. One of those, just criticizing them allows us to blow off steam. Sure, I see that. But if you actually want to change behavior, which is a major component of management, right, is managing performance, then you're going to have to get a lot more specific. The major issue that we see in this whole discipline of performance management has to do with error. So there's these guys that have done what's called a meta-analysis. They've done it multiple times, and they set out to answer the question, on average, are managers accurate? Do they actually evaluate performance that's consistent with the performance of their employees? And they found out, depending on which study you look at, it's about 90% error, which I think some people know that, but I want that to sink in, that your salary, your promotion, your firing, your layoff, all that stuff is determined with 90% error. And it leaves us the question of, if they're not accurately evaluating performance on average, what is it that they are evaluating? And the answer, I think, is a relationship. You have a good relationship with your boss, that's really helpful. If you're good at your job, great. You have to do that. That's nuts and bolts, bread and butter. Like, you have to be able to deliver on your job. But if you deliver on your job and there's no relationship with your manager, it won't be as good as if you deliver on your job with a positive relationship with your manager. All kinds of problems in it. We'll go through a bunch of these. One of them is called procedural justice. That is, people have kind of innately a right, or at least they believe they do, to know what they're being evaluated on and what the procedures were for their evaluations. Standards have to be clear, communicated in advance. I couldn't come to the end of class and say, well, here's your grade, and not ever tell you how I'm grading you. We would say that's probably not very fair. The instruments get really complex. That creates a problem for managers using them as well as employees trying to interpret them. And the final one there, number 5, is people ought to have input into the process, meaning, yes, you're my manager, but you don't actually know my job. So let me explain to you what I think the hardest parts or the most value-added parts of my job are, and that should be accounted for in the process. So lots of problems. It's complex always when you're dealing with people, and when you do performance management, you're almost making a statement about them, right? If they work 50, 60 hours a week at this job and you say you're good or bad, it has a massive impact on their personal life. So at a macro level, when we talk about performance management, it's pretty clear, no rocket science here. Make it clear what the organization expects. Give people the tools that they need as well as feedback they need to do it, and give them a chance to do it. Part of performance management is documenting, did they do it or did they not do it? Why does that matter? Well, there's two main kind of umbrellas that we think about with performance management in terms of utility. One of them is administrative and one of them is developmental. From an administrative perspective, we have to document poor performance if we're going to fire someone, and how we're going to predict salary, stuff like that, if we're going to promote someone. And from a developmental side, we want to document what they're doing that's good and areas they need to improve, so we create stronger, more capable human capital. So both of those are happening at the same time, and they often get mixed. From a cultural perspective, there's some things. I made this mistake multiple times before I kind of started to catch on here, is that the way that people are evaluated has significant cultural undertones. And I don't want you to think about this like, okay, great, so if I go to South Korea, I have to be careful how I do performance management. No, because you probably have a South Korean on your team. It's not just out there, outside the United States. It's in here because we have a multicultural workforce. So a few things. One, it's uncommon in many cultures for managers to even give feedback. If your manager comes to you and says you're not doing a bad job, you would translate that as like, well, you hate me and I'm a worthless human, versus how I grew up. I mean, that was constant. Maybe how you grew up is, you do it right, good job. You do it not right, bad job. And it was, okay, they're not making a statement on my value as a human. They're just making a statement on this thing that I did. But it's culturally connected. Younger subordinates don't engage in joint discussions with their managers. There's a thing called power distance. I remember my PhD program, one of the directors there, this guy named Song Lee. I mean, you could hang out with him. I remember one time I was walking through the halls and I was like, good morning, Dr. Lee. And he didn't say anything. He just looks at me like how dare you just address me? Who do you think you are? Just, you can feel the distance, the social distance within and between levels in an organization. And so if I'm a manager and I'm working with someone from a culture of high power distance, and I say, hey, let's talk about your performance, it's going to be yes or no, sir, on average, or else it'll be devastating. The last one is criticism. I mentioned this, is not seen as useful feedback. Like, oh, okay, my manager's telling me to do these things different. What's hurt is my manager believes I failed. So this doesn't mean that we modify the whole system, but it means each person that we sit down with as a manager and give them performance feedback, try to develop them, we got to keep in mind that person has a story, that person has a culture, and has a set of beliefs, and it requires some emotional intelligence, some social intelligence to read the environment as we go through this process of performance evaluation. So again, at a macro level, how do we know if we're geared toward a performance culture versus an entitlement culture? Performance culture will do a few things, and hopefully they'll do them really well. Number one, everybody knows what's expected of them. There's a whole research field on a thing called role clarity. That is, what is my job? What am I supposed to deliver? Not just behaviors, but actually outcomes. This is the value proposition of my job. So that should be clear. Goals, deadlines should be clear. I should get some feedback on that job so I know if I'm doing good or poor, so I can adjust my behavior. If my manager doesn't know that, or if I don't know how to take that feedback, some training involved, And the last one, and you see this a lot, especially in more bureaucratic structured institutions, there are no consequences of poor performance. I had a conversation with actually the president of the university last night about, well, like, basically, what do you think about tenure? I come from a private sector where tenure is no, like you contribute, you produce value, or you're not here, and it's different. It was interesting to hear his take on it. But the bottom line is, if you're going to have a performance-oriented culture, there has to be a consequence to poor performance. Otherwise, people don't believe it. It's just dead wood in the organization, and nobody respects it. Okay, how to measure it. There's a lot of different ways you can measure it. One of the things that you won't see on here very much, we know quality, quantity, timeliness, stuff like that. Depends on the job. One of the things that you won't see on there is usually ethics. I want to talk about this a little bit later, but we do a lot in a business school to try to get at the idea of personal ethics and business ethics, professional standards, not just legal standards, but actually moral standards. And you usually won't have that attached to a performance evaluation because there's such variance. So a manager says, you swear too much. You use the F word, to me that's unethical, and I mark you down for that, and it affects your performance. Well, if you're not in a sales job and you're in a back corner and nobody hears it and it doesn't create any tension, or maybe you are but everybody does it, somebody would say, well, hey, wait a second, that's not really fair that you project your personal sense of ethics on me. There's no professional standard. There's no universal agreed to norm there. So it just gets a little dicey. You can do it. Usually what I say is when you're firing someone for performance, it's pretty hard. It takes a while, and you have to have your ducks in a row from a documentation perspective. But if you're firing someone for ethics, if it's clean, or safety, those are usually a lot easier. They're not any more fun. Firing people isn't fun, but they're usually a lot easier. Let's talk about the nature of feedback. So I referenced this early on. There are 3 types of feedback. So when you sit down with someone in a performance evaluation exercise and you say you always want to sandwich it, right? It's not rocket science. Here's what's going really well. Point out you don't say in general, you're doing well, but specific, right? Things they can take away. What you did on X project was good. They can make the connection. That was the right thing. So they can modify their performance accordingly. So you want to go positive, areas of development, positive. Everybody knows that. Just like if you're in disagreement with somebody, positive, challenge, positive. But there are 3 types of feedback that we can give. And one of them is trait. And that is just the traits that the person has. So, hey, you have a good attitude or good teamwork, or you show a lot of initiative. That's not really helpful. Nobody can take that and then modify their behavior accordingly to have better performance. Rather than saying you have good teamwork, you might say you don't miss meetings. You show up to meetings on time and you're prepared for your presentation. All your PowerPoints or your documents are submitted beforehand, stuff like that. So those are more behaviors that someone can go, oh, okay, these meetings I haven't done that, these I have, so I can modify my behavior. You can go all the way to results. That's more difficult, but you can say because your information was there, the team was able to make a decision in a 2-hour discussion and not a 2-week committee. That saved us X amount of time and dollars. Good job. So the further you can go down on this list, the better. This is, in my view, one of the biggest challenges for managers, because it's especially when you're rating 10, 15 people's performance, it's so much easier just to go right to trait. Oh, Joe, he's kind of a lazy bum. So you figure out some clever words instead of lazy, and you tell Joe he's a lazy bum. It's not really helpful. You got to tell Joe why. Why do you think that? What behaviors does he do that makes you think Joe is a lazy bum, and how does it affect the business? That's the results. So therefore, he can at least have a chance to modify his behavior. Standards. I just want to get this slide up here to make sure we get the standards come from the job analysis. We covered this earlier. That little document, assuming it's up to speed and consistent with the year that you're in, because sometimes they expire, is really important, because that's not only what a judge and a jury is going to go to, but it's also a fairness issue with the employee. These are what we said are these behaviors or these outcomes are good performance, and these are bad performance, and yours is obviously whatever it is, X or Y. So it's documented, it's steady, and this shows that it's not made up on the spot by a manager. Well, I just changed these performance evaluations and marked this person down. That's not okay. It has to be anchored. It's an issue of what's called procedural justice. Here's an example we might see. on a particular criteria. So the performance level you can see on the left, superior, acceptable, needs improvement, and then lists of behaviors on the right. Not lists of traits, but list of behaviors on the right. These are the things that we do that generate needs improvement, acceptable, or superior performance. If you have something like this, if you don't create it, this is something we show with employees, not when we sit down for performance evaluations, but so they know in advance. This is what good performance is and what it isn't, so they can modify their behavior accordingly. I mentioned this with ethics. It's not usually up there. Sometimes, if it's in clear ethical roles, especially if you're dealing with like a CEO, insider trading, something like that. But that's really a legal issue at that point, not an ethical issue. As I said, 2 major umbrellas. So this one exercise, some people break it up twice a year, but this one exercise is useful for 2 things. There's an administrative role. We have to have this documentation, this evaluation to back up our business decisions. And then the other one is a developmental role. That is, where are you going next? What training or development opportunities do you need? Stuff like that. Coaching, mentoring, you can see it. So what some firms have done, and this is more work for the manager, but if you're a first-line manager, you already know everything floats up to you and everything is pushed down to you. So it's a very tough job, fun job, but tough job. Then what some firms have done is taken this, rather than saying, hey, we're going to do this once a year, they'll say we're going to do this twice a year. One time is going to be for the administrative piece, that is your pay, compensation, and the other one is going to be for development. Making you better, stronger as an employee. The reason we might separate those is because if I sit down with my boss who's talking to me about my performance, I might have only one question. Am I getting a raise, and if so, how much? Like that's it. And so you can talk about development all you want and how I'm doing in my career, and I just think, dude, I don't care. Am I going to get a raise? So by separating these 2, meeting times, if you will, these 2 processes, there at least can be a little bit more of a discussion around getting better as an employee and improving. We usually divide this up a couple ways. HR is usually in charge of architecting this process. That is ensuring that it's done in a fair way, reasonably up to speed. Make sure managers have everything they need to manage their employees. Employees know what to expect, stuff like that. But usually it's the managers are the ones who actually give the ratings. If I'm in HR for a group of accountants and I have 300 accountants that I support, I'm probably not going to evaluate their performance because I'm not an accountant. Probably their manager, their lead accountant, would be the one who would have the subject matter expertise to rate their performance. So not usually done by HR, but designed, architected, and executed through HR. Who conducts them in addition to managers? Kind of everybody can. It really depends on how much money and how much time you're willing to put in the process to make sure it's good. There's a thing called a 360-degree feedback. You can get that. It's kind of all around. So I'll just take my job as a faculty. I have a department chair who evaluates me. I have coworkers, I have peers who will sit in on my classes or evaluate my research, and I have students who evaluate me through the student evaluation of instruction. So in each way, it's not perfect, right? I don't have taxpayers come in and evaluate my performance, even though they're the ones paying for it. But the idea here is the more people you can get to assess, assuming you believe in the validity of the assessment, then the more accurate the picture of the performance might be. The other thing that this helps, having a multi-source appraisal, is if I have a really bad relationship with my manager, but I'm actually a pretty darn good employee, my manager won't be the only one having voice in that discussion. So it is harder, it's more complex to normalize the data. Good HR person can set this up. There's all kinds of third-party providers that set this up. Would we do this all the time? Probably not. It's expensive and time consuming. Would we do it on some key roles or maybe senior leadership roles? Yeah, we probably would. We probably should in terms of validity. So let's get into a few methods. What are the tools that people use to do this? Very popular one's called the graphic rating scale. So basically I rate someone high, low. There are some drawbacks to it. If you rated me, for instance, you said, AV as a professor, boy, he's really good at making copies, but he's not very good at talking to students. Well, that means I did good on one, bad on the other. We left out the idea that the second one is probably much more important than the first one. So it doesn't allow us always to kind of rate what's the most important, but usually the idea is to let us get the breadth of the job, everything involved. Here's an example in terms of kind of an overall outstanding, they're very successful, top 10%, unsatisfactory. I don't know if this person's going to be here. Maybe they should let go, and everything in between. You can go based on expectations if you want. That's popular, exceeds, below expectations. The challenge of that, as we know, is that expectations vary within and between people. So if you have 3 managers in a room that just evaluated their team, that's 3 different sets of expectations. You have to somehow normalize that data when you end up coming together. Probably the most valid approach with a graphic rating scale would be what's called behaviorally anchored rating scales, or BARS, another one of the HR acronyms. The purpose of BARS is to create the anchors, but not set on expectations, to be set on actual behaviors. So here's an example in terms of customer service. Outstanding service exceeds expectations. Outstanding service, in this case, is use positive phrases to explain a product. So the more that you can tie them to behaviors, it's a lot of work. I get it. When I have this conversation during consulting, you can see just the overwhelmed look on managers and HR people like, she's going to take forever. Yes, it does take a long time. And if there isn't massive shift in the nature of the work, if you do it once right the first time, it should be a sustainable benefit to the organization. Ranking's fine. You get a 1 through N. I have 6 people on my team. I just rank them the best through the worst, 1 through 6. One of the challenges with that, of course, is that you can't get degrees of separation. So on my team, I might have 6 people. I might have 2 people who could run it by themselves. Like, they're incredible. They pull up everybody else. They're the mistake eraser. I mean, they're just incredible. And the bottom 4 are kind of subpar. Well, it looks like number 3 is just a little bit less optimal than number 2 if I do a ranking. But in real life, there's a massive gap right there. So ranking works fine. Better not to do it mechanically to crank out like a salary increase because it won't recognize those the variance in performance. Forced distribution is another one that works. You can say, some people are going to be high, some people are going to be low, and on average, people are average. I should say, remember that the rest of your life. It's kind of one of my lines I throw out in class a lot. On average, people are average. Nobody thinks they're average, but on average, people are average. So this would be on a scale of 1 to 5. Most people get a 3. There's a handful of 4s, handful of 2s. There's a couple 5s and a couple 1s. This works, but what if you have overall a really low performing team? A bunch of boneheads, and you have to go sit down with a half of that team and say they were above average. When in your head, you're like, yeah, you're above average on the team, but our team stinks. Or reverse that. What if you have a team with just stellar all-stars, lots of years of experience, great track record of results? You have to sit down with half of that team and tell them they're below average. So it can create some social, some relationship problems between the manager and the people who are being rated. Forced distribution is, again, it works if you're talking about a big enough sample size. If you're talking about, your whole company, 200 people, yes, on average, people are average. But you as a manager may have a specific team that doesn't necessarily fit the forced distribution model. Looks something like this, and you can see it. On average, people meet expectations. But again, the forcing is kind of fitting a square peg into a round hole. Sometimes it doesn't fit. If the sample size is big enough, usually it will. There's another one called the narrative method. I recommend this as a supplementary method, not as a primary method. It is useful. And you hear stuff of your manager, you've heard stuff like you have to document this, right? Document what happened because we're going to give them a raise. Document what happened because we're going to fire them. Some of that's driven back to if I was to take that mindset and apply it completely to the performance evaluation process, you'd have what's called the narrative method. And this is the joke is a manager walking around with a black book, and every time you do something, opens it up and kind of writes it down. This can be abused really easily. A lot of training is required for managers on how to do this. They sit down once a year with the employee, they look at the record at the annual evaluation, and they walk through it. Well, negative is stronger than positive, right? And so most things that you do well don't stand out unless they're really extremely well. And most things that you do poorly do stand out more because they're deviant from the norm. And so you have a manager who sits down with an employee and they have a list of, these are the 30 dumb things you've done over the last year. You have an employee go, what about the 3,000 good things I did? Like, do you have any of those by chance? So it can create some problems. If you are like, if I have a manager call says, I'd like to fire this person, it's performance related, we suspect there's going to be a lawsuit, an appeal, something, a grievance, I'll go, okay, stick with the narrative method for a while, because that's really your ammunition. The narrative method will provide you with the justification you need to take action if you need to take action. So it's nice to supplement with this. Very few places do this exclusively. I'm told that in school districts, this is still how it's done, meaning like a high school teacher, you have a principal that comes in and writes a page, 2 pages, kind of evaluation. Last I heard, Boeing Employees Credit Union was doing this, but outside of that, it's a good supplementary method. Think of it like you have a toolbox as a manager, right? This is one of the tools in your kit. It doesn't apply to every particular situation. Yeah, an essay. Last one is more of a principle. It's kind of a method, but it's also more of a principle, and that is, it's called management by objectives. So here's the idea. Let's say, like I don't want a tool. I don't want a forced distribution. I don't want a ranking. I want to make it simpler, where it's fair to my employees, and I can assess their performance. So MBO, management by objectives, is where you sit down with someone once a year, once every 3 months, every 6 months, whatever it is. But usually it's annually, and you say, these are your objectives for the year. This is what I would like the business is asking you to deliver, in a sense, for your salary here, for your spot here. And the employee comes back and says, I can do more. Well, okay, we figured it out. The employee comes back and says, those are unfair expectations. I can't do that. And so there's some negotiation, but you lay out the objectives. These are these 5 statements, and then you define, here's what success looks like, and here's what failure looks like for these 5 things that we said were your job for the next year. From there forward, management of that person's performance looks like meeting with them, pulling out that piece of paper and go, let's go through the 5. Like, how are we doing? We agreed 8 weeks ago, 8 months ago, this is what constitutes good performance on your job. Like, how you doing? How can I support you? What do you need? Is there anything blocking you from being able to be successful as we together defined it? MBO is kind of based on this precedent of, it's a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I might have mentioned it before. Dumb book, don't read it. but the second, let me just comment on that. When I rip on books, whenever a book comes out and says, now these are the 6 things to be a great leader, or the 3 I's of leadership, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. It totally disregards context. Every area, every culture, right? Organizational culture is unique. So apologize for my bad attitude. But it's based on this idea of number 2 from this book, begin with the end in mind. And that is, let's all agree right now where we're going. It's almost like organizational strategy or mission. Let's agree where we're going. If we can agree where we're going, then we can begin to draft up some objectives and some tactics to help us get there. But let's start with that. Let's define the future. So we're sitting here, you and I, in this one-on-one performance evaluation conversation, and we say, okay, in 1 year from right now, what do we want to look back and go, this is what we did, this is how we did it, and this is how it was a win for the business and for the person doing it. So that's it. Begin with the end in mind. That kind of informs the process of MBO. Again, I said this at the beginning, I'll say it again. There is no single method. If a manager says, this is how we used to do performance in my company, let's do it here, that's where you want to go. Time out, wait a second. Does it fit with the culture? Does it fit with the job? If you evaluate a NASA engineer, it's different than if you evaluate someone who's bucking bales of hay than it is someone who's fill in the blank, making French fries. So you got to figure out what fits, what kind of performance is even measurable. If they're quantitative basis for performance, there's a firm that I have a lot of respect for. It's called Lamb Weston. They're out in Quincy. And a lot of their leaders are judged on kind of a dashboard of quantitative output. So there's no question, if you're a manager, leader, shift supervisor, there's no question of, did I do a good job today? Like, the numbers are right there in front of your face, and you can modify your behavior according to that feedback. Some jobs don't have that, right? So, like, I'll state mine, like, as a professor, like, you try hard, you do your best, you do what you think works, and you find out in 5 years when someone calls you and says, hey, I'm the youngest HR manager of this X company, and I've been doing what you said, and you're like, oh, man, maybe I did something right. So some jobs give you quick feedback, and some jobs aren't really designed for it. So you got to pick the one that fits for that job. There are, of course, problems in the interview. I already mentioned that the biggest thing is probably the person's relationship with their manager. So I live in Ellensburg, Washington, small town, Eastern Washington kid. I can drive a tractor and drive a quad and plow snow, and I like to be out in the mountains. Well, if my manager is from Rwanda and is an 85-year-old Rwandan woman who grew up in the Bronx, okay, we don't have a lot in common on paper in terms of demographics. So we're both going to have to work really hard to have like a trusting, optimal social exchange. So that's going to affect how she is going to evaluate my performance. So that's kind of the constant that's out there. What is a relationship like? Some other potential challenges are varying standards. The same manager has different standards for different people. Oh, that's Joanne. Well, she just went through a tough divorce, and so we're going to go a little bit easy on her in terms of performance evaluation. Then there's error in the process. The process isn't trusted, isn't valid, or vice versa. We're going to be a little bit more difficult on her, because she's been here 10 years in the same job, and we expect more of her. So varying standards between managers is usually where this is the worst. Manager evaluates performance. They go to sit with the senior manager just to cross-check it. Senior manager says, no, I don't like those people, or I don't like how you evaluated them. Recency and primacy effects. If they did one thing that stood out, also called halo effect, something about this person I really like, or one project they did. Another recency kind of effect is called Horns effect. Well, they did great all year, but 2 weeks ago they bombed on a project, so I'm going to hurt them now. So trying to take into account the whole time period. I see a thing called central tendency or leniency bias a lot. I don't see strictness bias a whole lot. So let's talk about this because I want to extract our minds for a minute from an HR person architecting a process to a manager and an employee who maybe have known each other for years. There's a friendship, there's a professional relationship there, and the manager is going to give that person feedback, and it can't not affect their relationship. So I have a boss right now. I really like my friend. All my bosses right now are great, but if one of them has to sit down with me and say, James, like, you suck at your job. Here's why, and here's the behaviors. And let's say they do it well. That's gonna put a wedge in our relationship. And so one of the things with us as HR professionals, we got to bear in mind, this is not just a process that we put together, we ship out, and we say go, and best of luck, let the chips fall where they may. This is where if managers rate somebody low, it's going to be harder for the manager to manage that person for the next year because the person's probably hurt and probably doesn't trust the manager, or at least trust them less. So we have to keep that in mind of the process. They're human beings, ego, psychology, esteem, stuff like that on the table. With these biases, central tendency is basically, if I have a scale of 1 to 5, I'm going to put everybody around a 3, maybe 1, 4, and 1, 2, but keep everybody in the middle. Why would I do that? Because I don't have to defend my decisions. I don't have to explain to everybody why you didn't get higher, because almost everybody was a 3. Leniency bias is on a scale of 1 to 5. I put everybody 4 and 5. I put everybody high because, gosh, I just love everybody. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, that's a manager who is trying to avoid conflict, trying to be maybe professionally savvy, but trying to avoid conflict and hurt feelings and work for themselves. I have rarely seen strictness bias. I've seen it a couple times. It's engineer I used to work by the name of JT. He did this once, and he came back with his evaluation on a scale of it was 1 to 10, and everybody was like a 1, 2, and a 3. And of course, everybody else has leniency bias, so their engineers are 8, 9, 10. And he comes in and he says, I think I did this process wrong. It was pretty funny. But strictness bias is where nobody's good enough. It's the angry dad. Nobody's good enough here. Halo and Horns, I mentioned that. The classic, of course, is, are they like me? And if someone is like me, well, they're probably good. Why? Because I have a thing called self-esteem, and I try to engage in my life in such a way to uphold that, because it hurts if I don't. So if you're like me, you're probably good. If you're not like me, you're probably bad. Very base level, archaic thinking leads to all types of bias and problems, and affects pretty much everyone. So different raters. As a manager, let me back up. As an HR person, we're aware of these and we train people in them. And you can't, you're not going to go up to somebody and say, oh, well, this is your bias. I mean, maybe it's obvious, but probably not. But you're going to say, as a manager trying to do their job right, let's keep these things in mind, right? What we're going here for is accuracy, not a manager's preference. We're going for accuracy. What is the most valid assessment of your employee's performance? As an agent of the business, that is our job as a manager, to advance the interests of the business, which may be, I don't like this person on my team. They're a jerk. I can't stand working with them, but they're really good at their job. Then their performance evaluation needs to reflect that accordingly. When you do the interviews, a few hints you can look at here. One of the biggest ones that I typically see is a manager. An employee wants to know, are they getting a raise? I get that. That's fair. A manager comes in, wants to get the meeting over with because it's kind of uncomfortable, and so they come in and they say, here are the good things, here are the bad things, have a nice day, without establishing some kind of a dialogue, like beginning the conversation with, let's talk about the year. Like what did you love? What did you hate? What was a win? What was a loss? And kind of creating a dialogue so there's what you might call active listening. So somebody you have voice in somebody's life. So when you say, hey, you did good, they get that and they keep going. When they say, hey, let's work on this, they get that and aren't just instantly defensive. So few hints. Bottom line, this is one of the more complex but absolutely bread and butter when it comes to HR processes, is evaluating someone's performance. We use it to not only strengthen them as employees, but of course for some of our administrative and business level decisions we need to make about their career and their job. So that's it for Chapter 10.